So the second chapter for this module is chapter 7, which kind of addresses race, ethnicity, nationality, and health. Similar to chapter 5 on social inequality, I provide you some sociological context for the discussion that your book launches into. Um, so you want to make sure that you pay close attention to the slides in the video, particularly if you are not a sociology major and you haven't taken a race and ethnic relations course in the sociology department. But who knows, even if you have taken such a course, if you didn't take it with me, which I doubt any of you have, it is still very important to pay close attention to this background contextual material. So, in the same way that the last question began with this question about does our health vary based on who we are, and we were talking about social class. This chapter I want you to consider the same thing. That when we ask people about their self perceptions of health, there seems to be this racial disparity where non-Hispanic whites were most likely to say that they were in excellent, very good health status, while comparatively fewer non-Hispanic Blacks, Hispanics, Asians, Hawaiian Pacific Islanders, and Native Americans said that same thing. And similarly, there were differences in who rated their health as being fair or poor. So let's go over some background material so we can understand those concepts of race and ethnicity, and then we will end the presentation by talking in more detail about that relationship between race, ethnicity, and health. So it's worth noting that this book, with its UK authors, focus initially on migration. And why is that? And that's because so much of the UK's racial diversity is largely the product of migration. People, moving to the area from other parts of the world. And so they talk about what they call the 6 trends of new migration. And while some of those trends are, and most of these trends are relevant to all the global migration that's occurring, including the migration that is in the US. But perhaps, one unique quality about migration as we compare countries is that especially considering something like the growing politicization of migration. That's related to the social, cultural kind of environment of a given country. And your book does mention that other countries have different socio-historical context in regards to racial ethnic relations. So they mention the UK and their role in colonialism, neocolonialism, and how that impacts, their perception of people who immigrate from other countries, particularly other countries that used to be English colonies. And they mentioned that there are other countries that have their own kind of unique socio-historical background. They talk about South Africa and the apartheid system. They talk about Australia and the white settler policy. But obviously, we're students here in the United States. So what about America? So to kind of get us started, I'm going to pick apart some of the terms. I'm going to talk about what the racial ethnic makeup of the United States looks like. Then I'll talk a little bit about history before we make our way back to health. So, how do we distinguish between these terms, race, ethnicity, and nationality? Well, the most straightforward one, nationality, is the nation that you're from. If you are not an immigrant, then the nation that you're from is the United States. Sometimes people might come up to you and say, oh, what's your nationality? And what they're really trying to probably get at is what your race or ethnicity is. And so, your race is commonly referred to as, the shared physical characteristics that a group of people are identified as having, right? So it's the idea that a group of people share a phenotype, they look similar, while ethnicity is seen as being kind of these shared kind of cultural components that a group might have in common. Things like language or religion or even ancestry. Oftentimes in America, we combine those two, race and ethnicity, to refer to groups as racial ethnic groups, which broadly speaking, these are groups that we consider to have shared physical characteristics, things like skin color, hair texture, facial features, as well as some shared cultural components as well. So in America, the kind of popular racial ethnic configuration is the 5-group configuration. We have non-Hispanic whites, we have non-Hispanic blacks, we have Hispanic Latinos, we have Asian, Native Hawaiians, other Pacific Islanders, and then we have American Indians, Alaskan Natives, Native Americans, First Peoples, right? Whatever kind of terminology you use there. So we collect data every 10 years. Hopefully you all participated in the census. So our last census was in 2010. So this, and it's 2020 and we're collecting census data as we speak. So this data is certainly, as old as census data can be, but it is still the most relevant, complete data that we have. So, what would you guess would be the population percentages of these 5 groups? Because that is some key information that we collect on the census. Just take a moment, maybe jot it down to yourself just to determine how accurate your perception of the racial ethnic makeup of America might be. All right, how right were you? Well, if you said for non-Hispanic whites, it's 64%, Blacks, African Americans, 12-13%, Hispanic Latinos, 16%, Asian, Native Hawaiians, other Pacific Islanders is 5%, and American Indians, Alaska Natives is 1%, then you're absolutely right. If you are, I used to do this in my in-person classes, and oftentimes my students in California would be really off in their measurements of the white population, which would then lead to them usually overestimating the presence of usually Hispanics, but sometimes also African Americans. And that's because, of course, you got to think in the United States, we have some states that have a very large minority presence. And then we have some states where there are virtually almost no minorities. So, you have to just kind of keep that in mind, that even though you're living in a state that has, a higher amount than average of minority populations, that's certainly not true of every state. So this is just the 2010 information. They collect information about people's ancestry, to the best of their knowledge. And they note that we know that people don't always really have accurate information about this. So like Irish ancestry always tends to be overestimated among our white European descent populations. But how we get to the kind of basic of this information comes from 2 census questions, and at least in 2010 it was questions 7 and 8. The first question starts off about asking about ethnicity, and it's worth noting that Hispanic Latino is our only measured ethnicity. It's the one racial ethnic group that we measure separately as an ethnicity, and we further ask, are people Mexican, Mexican-American, Chicano? Are they Puerto Rican? Are they Cuban? And I'll talk a little bit in a second about why we pull those groups out. If they say no, then they go to the next question. If they say yes, then after they indicate their group, they still go to the next question, which is their race. And we have options here: white, different words for Black, American Indian, Alaskan Native, and we ask them to print the name of their enrolled or printable tribe. We give several different options for Asian and Pacific Islander subpopulations. And we give people the ability to write in some other race. But if you've ever taken a quantitative methodology course, you know that you really want to avoid just writing in some other race. People do that. I've worked on questionnaires where we collect race data and people will write in things like human or why, And all it really does is result in missing data, and it makes a lot of the other of the data that they may be included on their questionnaire harder for us to know what to do with. It becomes less useful. So it's worth noting that part of why we distinguish between white non-Hispanic and Black non-Hispanic is because after indicating their ethnicity, Hispanic Latinos are prompted to also enter a race. They don't get to skip this question. So it's just worth noting that, like I said, that is the one group that we pull out separately as an ethnicity based upon the shared cultural characteristic of language. And then we do take up information about for Hispanic Latinos, kind of their nation of origin. So 2/3 are Mexican descent. And part of the reason why we want to know that is because they're our neighbor to the south. We share a large border. There is a lot of cultural rejuvenation because there is a pretty steady influx of immigrants, as well as people going back to visit people, family members in Mexico. So this is just a subgroup of interest to us. Puerto Rico, part of why we pull them out separately is because they are citizens. Puerto Rico is a territory of the United States. So Puerto Ricans have a unique status of being, although technically, yes, they are from another country, they're from another country that belongs to the US. So they are citizens. Cuba, part of why we pull apart Cuba, even though they're only 4% of the Latino population, is because of our kind of unique history with Cuban and Cuban Americas. We got our first major influx of Cubans during the rise of Castro. And so, like any people who would be the first to flee if your country is kind of embracing wealth redistribution, a lot of those people were wealthy, and America welcomed them with open arms and gave them additional resources to fight the spread of Marxism back in their home country. And later waves of Cubans became less educated and less wealthy, but it still stands today that Cubans are disproportionately wealthy, more likely to be business and homeowners, have higher education. And so it's very useful if we're wanting to get a more accurate snapshot of US Latinos, that we be able to pull kind of Cubans out because they skew the statistics kind of in an upward manner. And it's not necessarily an accurate picture of what's going on with the other 96% of Latinos. Same thing, we collect specific data about the subpopulations of Asian countries. Sometimes students are surprised that, we don't have more people of Japanese descent in people's minds. I guess Japanese Americans are more prominent than what they are, but they're actually a much smaller proportion of the Asian American group. Instead, we get large percentages of people from China, India, and the Philippines. And out of all of our racial ethnic groups, it is our Asian Pacific Islanders that have the highest proportion of first generation immigrants. They primarily come to America on work and school visas. And so for that reason, they also wind up being kind of a disproportionately educated group, which consequently means that they also have higher incomes and home ownership rates when compared to other minority groups, which are in the cases of Native Americans and African Americans, much less likely to be comprised of voluntary immigrants. And in the case of Latinos, the immigrants that come over most of our Asian immigrants are further classified by what we call human capital. They're human capital immigrants. Like I said, they're coming over for admissions to higher education or occupations that require higher education. In terms of what we call mixed race individuals, people that are biracial or multiracial, they're roughly 3% of the population. We don't really have a very accurate measure on the multiracial population, and that has a lot to do with the fact of, historically, we did not allow people to claim two races. That's only been a possibility since the 2000 census. Even in terms of their identity, a long part of our history has been pushing people to see themselves as one race, particularly if they are mixed with white and a minority race. There was a lot of pressure through one-drop laws, to identify as being the minority race. And a lot of that mindset still is pervasive today. So people, think about former President Obama, or the actress Halle Berry, or, The Rock, or, a large number of celebrities and people in the public eye who are biracial or multiracial. And although some of them, for instance, Tiger Woods, who famously claimed he was Cablinasian, do embrace this multiracial identity, a lot of them don't. And oftentimes because there is still this kind of pressure to identify, with one race, particularly the minority group. So we are diverse. We are a diverse country. We're one of the more diverse countries, in the world, and we're only expected to become more diverse over time. You can see that some groups are going to shrink in size, Native Americans, but perhaps the story you hear about more, of course, is Europeans, whites of European descent. And some groups are going to grow in size, Latinos, as well as Asians. And African Americans are largely remaining stable. And a lot of this has to do more with just the basic demography, births and deaths, as opposed to immigration policies. So, at this point, it's not so much about immigration as it is about natural increase or decrease. The largest generation of whites of European descent are baby boomers, and they are mostly probably almost all going to be dead by the time we hit 2050. By comparison, Latinos are a very young racial ethnic group. Their largest generations are 25 and younger. So our young people. So not only are they not likely to be overwhelmingly dead in the next 30 years, but they also are going to be, during those years, those are reproductive years. So we could expect that their families will just naturally grow, and not because of the stereotype that they have huge families. Statistically speaking, they have slightly more than 1.5 children more than white families and African American families. But you just take both of those two trends and put them together, and what you have is a group that is going to just naturally increase. So, as we talk about groups declining in size and groups decreasing in size, it's a good time to emphasize that the majority group does not necessarily need to be the numerical majority. Now, historically in America, the majority group, who are whites of European descent, have been the majority group. But if at some point they stopped being the numerical majority, it doesn't mean that they would lose majority group status, because in sociology, majority group really refers to a group that is advantaged in respect to other groups in terms of social status, meaning that they enjoy these kind of structural privileges, in terms of education, in terms of employment status, in terms of wealth, in terms of political power. And what does it mean to be advantaged in respect to other groups? You have more than your disproportionate share. So if we look at something like political power, if whites of European descent had a proportionate amount of political power, it would be about 64%. But instead, you know, it's in the high 80s on the national level, and not much better on the state and local levels. So that is being advantaged in respect to other groups, because if you have more than your proportionate share, that means that there are some other groups out there that do not have their proportionate share. And so, thinking specifically about political power, I'll tell you that the groups that are particularly lack their proportionate share in terms of political power at the national stage are our Asian American Pacific Islanders and our Hispanic Latinos. So, you know, here's the thing. If you just really can't wrap your head around that the majority group is not the majority because they have the most people, then maybe instead of using the word majority group, you should use the similar term dominant group. I myself don't like the term dominant group, because when we talk about the other groups, instead of calling them minority groups, for dominant group, we would call them subordinate groups. And I just don't, I personally don't like that wording, but you will certainly see sociologists use that wording. So if it makes more sense to you to refer to the majority group as the dominant group, so you don't get tripped up over that whole numbers thing, then, you know, by all means, go ahead and do so. So what about minority groups? Well, these are the groups that experience unequal treatment and usually have less power over their lives because they're disadvantaged across, you know, several of those aspects that we just mentioned. Oftentimes they share a physical, cultural trait or characteristic that differentiates them. This is what has allowed them to remain minority groups and not be able to kind of blend in successfully with the majority group. Usually those characteristics are those that are determined at birth. They're not voluntary. So there are ascribed statuses like race in particular. And so because of that shared experience of unequal treatment and kind of being denied that full access to larger society, there is usually a they are a self-conscious social unit. So there's a strong sense of group identity. It's us against the world. And so traditionally there's been a tendency to marry within the group. Sometimes that's by choice and sometimes that's by law. So you have to think that in America, where we had anti-miscegenation laws that forbid the intermarriage between the majority group and most minority groups, particularly African Americans, you know, we had those laws on the books being enforced as late as 1967, you know, until the Supreme Court overturned those laws and declared them unconstitutional with Loving versus Virginia. So like I said, the primary basis for minority group status have historically been both globally as well as in America, race, ethnicity, and religion. So you can probably think of minority groups that fit any of those qualities. Another kind of key distinction between different minority groups is how they arrived in the US. And I kind of already hinted at that when I was talking about the voluntary immigration of human capital immigrants from Asian countries. So there are kind of three primary types of contact that could have led to a group becoming a minority group. The first one is colonization. Your group was already there, another group came in, they took over your area and territory, and then they pushed you to the bottom of the hierarchy. This is in essence what happened to Native Americans. And of course, you know, this was aided by warfare, you know, the rampant spread of illness like smallpox, and then also policies that further disenfranchise them, like the Trail of Tears and Relocation Act. Then you have annexation. Technically, annexation can be voluntary or involuntary. It's worth noting that in America's history, especially when you're thinking about the history of minority groups, a lot of that has been involuntary annexation. So, you know, think about the fact that the original kind of Mexican Americans in this country were a byproduct of the annexation of Texas and, most of the Southwest during, the war between the United States and Mexico, Spanish American War. Um, Similarly, although it's less discussed, our Pacific Islanders, our Native Hawaiians who were not immigrants but were already in Hawaii, that was also kind of annexation. Their queen at the time needed help, yeah, fighting off uh, would-be colonizers. She turned to America for help. And after providing assistance, America largely just remained in Hawaii, first as a kind of protectorate, but later just annexed Hawaii and made it into a state. And then finally, we get to immigration. Oftentimes when we think of immigration, people moving in, it's voluntary immigration. And it's just worth noting that groups that come over via voluntary immigration are normally a special subset of people. I mean, these people, even before we had immigration policies in place that made, it necessary to come for either work or school or family related reasons, even before that, these were people that had to have a certain amount of gumption, a certain amount of, work ethic and motivation. So, comparing voluntary, minority groups that are largely here because of voluntary immigration to minority groups that were colonized or annexed or involuntarily immigrated really isn't just a fair comparison. So what do I mean by involuntary immigration? Well, I'm talking about all of the Africans who were brought over primarily as slaves in the early history of the US, and then later, as we moved into the early 1800s, mid 1800s, solely as slaves. So, at first there was some mix between coming over as indentured servants versus slaves. And later this just became, involuntary immigration through the form of slavery. And so, keep that kind of history and some of those points in mind, when you consider the comparative well-being of these different groups. When you look at which groups are doing well, it's usually the majority group and the one minority group that is comprised almost solely of voluntary immigrants, which are the Asian Americans, Latinos, African Americans, Native Americans, whether you're talking about income, unemployment rates, poverty rates, or home ownership, are usually lagging behind. And we also see those distinctions in educational completion between these groups as well. So just take a minute to look over some of those graphs to kind of just get a sense of what these patterns look like in America. So where is, what does America, where do we stand now? We are what is classified as a majority minority country. What that means is that members of the majority group will no longer be more than 50% of the population. And we expect that we are getting there, if not already there. And so, the states that are already there are the states in blue. California, of course, is one. The states that we expect to be there within the next, 20 to 30 years are states like North Carolina, which is where I'm from. And the states that, we can safely expect to remain predominantly white of European descent, even past the next 30 years, are the states that you see in white. And so, all of this just raises questions about what the future will hold for America. And there are some possibilities. One possibility, which is commonly referred to as the salad bowl image, and more technically referred to as ethnic pluralism or multiculturalism, is that, we will continue to have all these different groups in America, and they will maintain their group identities. So they will be African Americans, they will be Mexican Americans, they will be Japanese Americans, they will be white Americans. They will be Native Americans, right? That their racial ethnic identity will remain strong alongside their nationality of being American. Another possibility, and back when our early forefathers were imagining this country, but largely only thinking about immigrants from other European nations, this was the model that they foresaw, is that that there would be assimilation, that people would move in, and then they would just conform to kind of our WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant core. They will become like the core group. And this has proven to be true, like I said, for a lot of European immigrants. This has become less true when you start considering the more recent immigrant experience, even the voluntary immigrant experience of people coming from Asian, South American, and African countries. A more hopeful model, but not one that has really proven to be true. This is the model that we associate, with America, the melting pot. It's worth noting that this is not really how it's been for anybody, for any group, with the exception of whites of European descent. Is the fusion amalgamation model, where groups come in and they forge a new identity and they forge a new culture. So it's not that you come in and you become more similar to the core, but you come in and you add your cultural elements, and together we are building a new identity. We are building a new American culture. What the future hopefully won't hold, but what the past certainly held, was separatism. And this is where you take certain groups and you separate them from the dominant group, the majority group. You treat them like second-class citizens, even within their own country. And so in America, the historical example of that is Jim Crow South, with the de jure segregation, the segregation by law, the whites only and black only water fountains and bathrooms and lunch counters, right? All the spaces were segregated. Globally, this is what your book was talking about when they were talking about the apartheid system in South Africa. And then finally, expulsion, extermination, succession. Once again, hopefully not in our future. To some extent, all of it has been in our past. So expulsion, after promising Mexico in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, that Mexicans could stay on their lands that were annexed by America, America proceeded to push later Mexican Americans out of the country. This was particularly the case during the Great Depression, a process we call repatriation, where we sent known Mexican Americans, meaning that these were people that were born in America, that were American citizens. We nevertheless sent them back to Mexico during this time period in the 30s. Similarly, of course, we removed Native Americans from their native lands and relocated them to reservations in the middle of the country. You can also say, and plenty of people do say, that that was another example of a group that, we exterminated. Partially by accident, through exposure to illness that they did not have any kind of natural immunities to, but then also, by policy and by force and warfare. And then finally, secession. Of course, the South tried that when, there was, when the country kind of split apart around the issues of primarily slavery. So, we have this really diverse country. It's going to get more diverse. It's not equal. And so, unsurprisingly, the book's point on page 111 that it is how a society is organized that exerts the main influence on ethnicity and health, rather than anything intrinsic to the culture or biology of the ethnic minority groups. This should not be surprising, right? It's not about, biological difference, because as we're going to talk about in a second, there aren't a lot of biological differences. And it's not even necessarily about culture. It's really about that socio-historical context. So, as I stated, biologically, there isn't a lot of difference between the groups. We think that there is, and that's because we look around and we look very different. But what we're seeing is our phenotypes. What we can't see is our genotypes. And it wasn't until the Human Genome Project, which was about 20 years ago, that we were able to actually break apart the human genome. And once we were able to do that, what we learned is that only about 0.01% of the total gene pool contributes to racial differences. So for us to look supposedly so different, we are not that different at the genetic level. If you go to that PBS website, they make the point that fruit flies have more genetic diversity between them than human beings on the basis of race. And there's actually more genetic variation within racial groups than between them. The book provides a great quote from biologist Stephen Rose on page 113, which kind of makes these same points, right? That a lot of this that we feel like is biological is really social. It's what we convinced ourselves was significant, more so than what has now been proven to be biologically true, discernible, and significant. But that doesn't mean that race isn't real, because although race doesn't have a biological basis, we've spent hundreds of years acting like that it does. So it's going to take more than 2 decades for it to go away. There's a saying, the Thomas theorem, that something is real if its consequences are real, right? So it's real if you believe it. And that is very true of race. We have spent centuries believing it, knowing that there's no biological basis between these groups, and that phenotypes are not as significant to our genome as we imagined that they would be. This hasn't necessarily changed people's minds. And this is especially true because race is a social construct, something that we created it with this socio-historical process, this process where we created categories, we treated people different ways, we passed laws that gave some people opportunities at the expense of others. Like, that history doesn't go away. Those categories that we gave power to aren't just going to disappear, because as it turns out, biologically, there isn't much base for them. And so your book does talk about the history of race as a social construct. They argue that the distinction before race was really between civilized and barbarian, and they make it a point to say that this wasn't 100% predicated upon skin color. There were European groups that were considered to be barbarian, and there were groups with darker skin in Northern Africa that were considered to be civilized. Instead, the kind of significance of race kind of came about during this time period of colonialism and later the slave trade. And that's because a justification system for these ways of treating people needed to be embraced in order to uphold those systems. And so that's when we start to see this system of race come about. And I sometimes have students that are like, oh, well, other countries had slavery before, this even happened. And once again, I just want to remind you that old world slavery was not race-based. It was not based on difference of phenotype, and it wasn't seen as being an intrinsic part of who a person was. Because you were born Black, you have to be a slave. Early slavery had a lot to do with warfare, owning people money, being captured. And there were oftentimes opportunities to earn your way out of slavery. And then certainly children that were born in slavery by the master were almost always freed. When slavery became race-based and lineage became traced through the mother, that was a unique departure from how things had been done previously. And so this just shows you one of our earliest racial taxonomies. It's by a guy named Carl Linnaeus. He's Swedish, you know, and it just shows you that, you know, the moment we started, you know, really classifying groups of people by their phenotype, it went beyond just saying, oh, people look differently. It also was establishing this system based on the idea of white supremacy, because when you read this, Homo sapiens europaeus definitely have the best alleged characteristics, according to Linnaeus. And if you believe that, then like I said, it provides a basis for colonialism. It provides a basis for slavery. And so, you know, it brings us to this idea of, you know, racism. So we have these this racial system. It really isn't based on biology. It was socially constructed, but it has power. And it's persisted, and it's not going away anytime soon. And unfortunately, one of the consequences of that way of organizing society has been you know, the creation of racism. So while this can be a contested concept, the basic definition is that it's a belief that one group is inferior to another, a belief that's further upheld by the practices of the dominant group to maintain the inferior position of the dominated group, often defined as a combination of power, prejudice, and discrimination. So why might this be contested? Well, that's because a lot of people love to call people racist, ignoring the fact that, you know, from a sociological standpoint and definition, you know, a person can only be racist in the fact if they have a system behind them. You know, one person hating you and treating you badly, I mean, that sucks. And that person is prejudiced, and they are perhaps practicing discrimination, terms that we'll talk about here in a second. But the idea of racism is that there is a system that has practices that uphold that person's treatment, that upholds that person's perception of you. So it's not about one person's behavior. Now, of course, when you're arguing with people, you know, on social media in the comments over, you know, something, whether it's Reddit or Facebook or Instagram, you know, nobody wants to go through this very nitpicky definition of racism. And people get really upset at the idea that only the dominant majority group can be racist. But hopefully you will kind of keep your kind of personal emotions, you know, outside of the definition, and look at it from this very systematic view that racism is about something larger than one individual. Because if you really just want to talk about what one individual can be, as I indicated, one individual, regardless of their race or ethnicity, can definitely be prejudiced as well as practice discrimination. So prejudice is a judgment, attitude, or opinion formed before the facts are known. And usually it's based on suspicion, intolerance, and irrational hatred of other races, religions, creeds, or nationalities. One specific type of prejudice is a stereotype, and this is an overgeneralization where you apply a set of characteristics to all members of a group. So, you know, all blanks are blank. And it's worth noting that even positive stereotypes are still a form of prejudice, because you are prejudging a person, you are thinking you know something about them on the sole basis of a group characteristic, not about who they are as a person. So even if it's something that you feel like is positive, like, you know, Asians are good at math, Blacks are good at basketball, you know, it is still problematic because you are still engaging in that prejudging behavior. Sociologists are often looking at measuring prejudice. It used to be a lot more straightforward because people were a lot more open to just state their prejudice beliefs. Now, of course, it's become more difficult because people know that it's not socially acceptable to say things like, I don't think this group is as smart as this group. So sociologists have taken to being a little bit more crafty. This is a content analysis of tweets where they went through and they looked at derogatory tweets directed
directed towards different subgroups by people who were not a member of that subgroup. And I usually like to give students a link to this study, because if you think about all of the people who are Hispanic Latino in California, it's worth noting that the 5 cities that had the highest proportion of slurs per tweet are in California, and the top city being Bakersfield. And so it just kind of this research just kind of suggests that diversity alone isn't going to make racism, prejudice go away. So if prejudice is like your thoughts and feelings, then discrimination is behavior, is treatment. It's the failure to treat people in the same way because of a bias towards them, because of some characteristic that is irrelevant to their suitability for whatever it is in question, right? So basically, it's discrimination when you treat someone differently on the basis of something that shouldn't matter, right? So, if I say I'm going to make the people that have the highest scores in my class are going to be my teaching assistants, and they all 3 just happen to be women, then it's not that I'm discriminating against men, because I based it on something like grades, which has the fact that it all wound up being one gender, is not the issue. But if I said, oh, I'm going to have TAs and I want them all to be women because I just think that women are better students and they're more helpful and accommodating, well, now I'm being discriminatory against my male students, and that's individual discrimination. This is the behavior that results in the equal treatment of a person or persons based on group membership. And it's worth noting that individual discrimination can be practiced by individuals, but it also can be practiced by groups. It's a group of people that are discriminating against a person, like if a frat doesn't allow certain members in because of their race, that's still individual discrimination, because institutional discrimination is discrimination that's been enshrined in law, public policy, or common practice. So it exists at the institutional level. It's not about individuals, regardless of how many individuals we're referring to. So it's basically something that's been embedded in the routine operations of major social institutions. So there are examples of institutional discrimination in businesses, schools, hospitals, government. A few examples would be like legacy admissions, redlining, which is a practice that used to be done by banks, is now prohibited, but is still perhaps done by banks. Subprime lending, which I talked about in the last chapter video. The war on drugs, which established, that crazy crack cocaine disparity, 100 to 1. For every 1 gram of crack, you would need 100 grams of coke in order to get the same length of sentence, which resulted in disparities in how largely poor minority drug users were treated versus richer, not majority drug users were treated, particularly in the 80s and the early 90s. So your book is like, okay, so, like race, it conceptually was based on biology. We now know that it's not true. It's a really flawed concept. So they're like, is ethnicity any better? And, they point out the problem with ethnicity, because it's a purely socio-cultural construct, is that, it can vary based on context. So a person's ethnicity, especially if you're talking about immigrants, can change. And just from a measurement standpoint, that variability can be problematic. The other issue about ethnicity is that, sometimes groups that we define as ethnic groups don't necessarily see themselves as an ethnic group. They don't really embrace that ethnic identity. And this is true of a lot of our pan-ethnicities, our groups that have a lot of smaller groups underneath them. So our Latino as well as Asian American groups, oftentimes they don't necessarily describe themselves with that pan-ethnic label. Instead, they say things like, I am Dominican American, I am from Honduras, I am Korean, I am Chinese American, versus that broad pan-ethnic label. So then the other kind of issue here is, if no one really uses that label, sees themselves that way, is this a really useful measurement? So there are pros and cons. Ethnicity doesn't quite have the baggage and the negative history that race has associated with it, but it's certainly not a completely non-problematic concept. So now, thinking a little bit about, so how does race intersect with health? How does our health vary based on who we are? So we know that there are distinctions in things like, for instance, life expectancy. We can see that some groups, particularly white women, live longer than, other groups. And that some groups, particularly Black men, they have much shorter life expectancies. So understanding kind of, what is underlying these racial distinctions and disparities is of major interest to sociologists who study health disparities. So one way in which race can kind of intersect with the study of health that your book discusses is what they call the ethnoization of a disease. And particularly they discuss sickle cell anemia, or what they call sickle cell disease. Because we so strongly associate SCD with people from African descent, your book discusses the fact that it's been overlooked in whites who have ancestors who developed this mutation, and this was a blood mutation that was developed in response to living in areas with high rates of malaria. And so, it was a beneficial adaptation, and a lot of people, it is a recessive trait. However, if two people with a recessive trait get together, now you have someone that has the disease. And as they said, this disease has become so closely correlated with race that it gets overlooked. It gets overlooked in populations where it isn't expected to be, and that's to the detriment of the patient. And it's also worth noting that we associate it so closely with race when it really needs to be closely associated more with the region. So we often think about this race as being present in, African Americans, Black Americans. But what we've learned now is that it is, it's not the Blackness, it is the ancestry that goes back to Western Africa. So African Americans who can trace their lineage to the eastern parts of the continent, they did not have this mutation in the same in their population. And so people who are descended from Eastern Africans versus West Africans, although people would think like, oh yes, you're Black, you are susceptible, to having this recessive trait, they really don't. So what else do we know about race and health? Well, a lot of focus, your book notes, has been about how, racism can impact health. And they go over kind of, the 5 primary findings from the systematic review of impact of racism on health. And additionally, they note that, there are direct and indirect effects of racism, and that part of the indirect effects is just that stress of experiencing racism, being exposed to racism. And that leads to the interesting finding that mental health seems to be more affected than physical health. Although your textbook does emphasize that those two, they are related. So perhaps there's more of a delayed effect. So, exposure to racism impacts your mental health, but, all those years of having depression or anxiety related to your experiences pertaining to race, they pop up in your body 30 years later as hypertension or a heart attack. So it may not be, so physical health may not be as non-impacted as the data would suggest. And then once again, like everything, the social context does matter. The socio-historical context matters. So there's the really interesting findings of Nasru et al., where they compare the health of Black, Caribbean, and white Americans with Caribbean and white English people. And, and what they find is that, that the Caribbean English are better off than Black Americans, but worse off than Caribbean Americans, while they're better off than the white Americans. So that context of both how your racial ethnic group is viewed in that society is kind of key, as well as what resources has your society offered in terms of contemporary resources as well as historical resources that could be impacting the health of the group. And this just emphasizes the concept that they had earlier introduced, that ethnic identity, because it is social, it can be fluid, but it also, to what extent is it fluid versus static? And so, they talk about how versus how the kind of negative effects of being Caribbean in the UK, because they have a more longer established history there, versus being Caribbean in the United States, where that ethnic identity is much newer, and in terms of being distinguished from just from Black Americans, and so how that leads people, how it impacts their health differently, because the identity is kind of seen differently, perceived differently, treated differently, based on whether or not you're in that England or America context. A similar study conducted in South Africa showed that, all racial minorities in South Africa were kind of worse off in terms of their psychosocial health relationships. And the authors kind of posit, the role of historical trauma. And certainly the story of a lot of minority groups, particularly in areas where they were not voluntary immigrants. A lot of those groups are coming from a place of historical trauma. For people who are interested in a potential topic, historical trauma and epigenetics, there's been a lot of interesting studies that have come out that go beyond the scope of this course, but are certainly very interesting to consider. And so, in the US specifically, there has been research that's looked at the intersection of race and health in relation to a lot of topics. Things like prenatal care and maternal mortality, racial bias and treatment by healthcare practitioners, post-opioid crisis, the disparities in opioid prescriptions was really highlighted, that racial minorities, particularly African Americans, were less likely to be prescribed these strong opioids by doctors. And part of it had to do with biases around, like, pain treatment, pain-seeking behaviors, or medication-seeking behaviors, and beliefs about pain tolerance. And so what on the face is a negative wound up in a backwards way being a positive, because that's part of why we haven't seen the same level of spike in opioid addiction and overdose among the African American population, because they weren't getting access to those legally prescribed opioids from their doctors, to the same extent that whites of European descent were. And I give you a graph that just kind of shows that distinction among children. So other types of things, suicide, depression, and other mental health issues. There's been renewed focus on looking at patterns and disparities among racial minority groups there. Eating disorders, something that's traditionally that was thought of as being a white middle-class female problem, has been expanded to consider how it might show up in other groups in different ways. That, no, it might not be anorexia, but it might be disordered eating or binge eating, which are eating disorders as well. And then, as of course we've talked about, life expectancy and what's contributing to those disparities between groups. The final point that your chapter leaves you with, and that I will leave you with, is that, one thing to keep in mind is, although we're talking about all of these social characteristics separately, that's not how people experience them. People experience intersectionality, that race is just one identity that intersects with our other social identities. And so we're not just defined by one social process. Instead, these different processes intersect, cut across, fuse together, and influence one another, according to your textbook. And that term intersectionality was coined by Black feminist Kimberly Crenshaw, and you see it pop up in a lot of spaces and in a lot of writings. But it's really just that idea that, even talking about these racial disparities is not clear cut, because, it becomes influenced by their social class, or their age, or their sexual orientation, or their gender. So just kind of keep that in mind. Yeah, we're talking about them all separately, but how people experience them in their real lives is intertwined.